November 9, 1850. Windsor Castle received a visitor whose presence would be recorded in the Queen's private journal, with the kind of clinical curiosity reserved for artifacts rather than children. Sarah Forbes Bonetta, 7 years old according to the naval captain who delivered her, stood in a room designed to make monarchs feel larger than the ceilings that held them while she waited to be examined by the most powerful woman in the British Empire. The journal entry that survives describes her woolly hair, her earrings, her Negro type, as if documenting a specimen brought back from expedition. What the journal does not record is the smell of gunpowder still caught in the folds of the dress someone had put on her for presentation, or the fact that 3 years earlier she had watched her family executed by men who would sell her twice before she turned 8. The Kingdom of Dahomey in 1847 was a machine built to process human beings into currency. King Gezo commanded a standing army that included 8,000 women trained as warriors and slavers, and his court operated on ceremonial violence performed for visiting Europeans who pretended shock while keeping their account books open. The kingdom's wealth came from raids on neighboring territories, and the Egbado people, to whom Sarah's family belonged, had become preferred targets because their royal lineages produced children who could be sold at premium to traders who understood that nobility, even African nobility, carried value in certain markets. Sarah's birth name was Aina, which carries meanings her captors had no interest in preserving, and her parents held rank sufficient to make her murder a ceremonial occasion rather than an efficient one. The raid that destroyed her village in 1848 was not war in any sense that European diplomats would recognize. It was harvest. Men came through at dawn with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggests practice, separating children from adults, killing those too old or too resistant to be profitable, and binding the rest for the forced march to Dahomey, Gezo's capital, where they would wait in pens until buyers arrived or until the king required bodies for his ritual demonstrations. Aina was 5 when she watched her mother's throat opened in front of a crowd that had gathered to watch the king assert his authority over life. And she was still 5 when she was placed in a holding area with other high-born children who would be killed or kept depending on Gezo's mood and the diplomatic calendar. She spent 2 years in that state, neither fully enslaved nor free, existing in the accounting category reserved for royal gifts and ceremonial sacrifices. She learned Fon, the language of her captors, because children's mouths adapt faster than their hearts, and she learned the silence that keeps a person invisible when being seen means being selected. She ate what was given and wore what was provided and practiced the stillness that prey animals master, when the only safety is in not drawing the hunter's attention. The other children in her group were killed in stages, selected for rituals timed to agricultural seasons and diplomatic visits, until Aina was one of the last, saved not by mercy but by the coincidence of Captain Frederick Forbes's arrival in Dahomey in 1850 on a mission to convince Gezo to abandon the slave trade that funded his kingdom. Forbes was a naval officer in the service of a British Empire that had declared itself opposed to slavery while still profiting from every commodity slavery produced, and his assignment was the kind of diplomatic theater that allowed London to claim moral leadership while maintaining commercial relationships with men like Gezo. The mission was doomed from the first meeting, because Gezo's economy depended entirely on the capture and sale of human beings, and no amount of British disapproval would convince him to bankrupt himself for the sake of appearing civilized to people whose own wealth had been built on his predecessor's labor. But Forbes had been sent with gifts and talking points, and he was expected to perform the ritual of asking even though everyone involved understood the answer would be no. The negotiations took place over weeks, with Gezo staging displays of his military power and his willingness to kill, making sure Forbes understood that British naval superiority ended at the coastline, and that the interior belonged to whoever could hold it by force. Human sacrifices were performed during Forbes's visit, not despite his presence but because of it. Demonstrations meant to establish that Dahomey's sovereignty included the right to dispose of its captives in whatever manner the king deemed appropriate. Aina was brought out for one such occasion, presented as the next body scheduled for ritual killing, and Forbes, whether from genuine humanitarian impulse or shrewd calculation of what would play well in his official report, asked Guizot to spare the child and give her to him as a gift for Queen Victoria. The king agreed, not because he valued British goodwill, but because the gesture cost him nothing and allowed him to appear magnanimous while refusing every substantive demand Forbes made. Aina was handed over with the phrasing that would be repeated in every account of her life: a present from the king of the blacks to the queen of the whites, language that turned a child into a symbol and erased the violence that had made the transfer possible. Forbes renamed her Sarah, after no one in particular, and gave her his own surname along with the name of his ship, HMS Bonetta, as if 3 English words could replace the identity that had been beaten out of her over 2 years of captivity. She sailed for England in 1850, 7 years old according to Forbes's estimate, her real age as unknowable as her real name, carrying nothing from her former life except the specific shape of her trauma and the sound of her mother's last breath. The voyage took months, and Sarah spent it learning English from Forbes and the ship's crew, who treated her with the kind of distant kindness men reserve for creatures they consider curiosities. She learned to eat food that had been cooked in ways that made her stomach revolt, and she learned to sleep in a hammock that swung with the ship's motion, and she learned the English words for obedience and gratitude and the Virgin Mary, who was supposed to love her in ways that her own mother, dead in Dahomey's execution ground, apparently could not. She arrived in England in the autumn of 1850 and was placed temporarily with Forbes's family while he arranged the formal presentation to Queen Victoria, which took place at Windsor Castle on November 9th and lasted approximately 15 minutes, long enough for the Queen to record her observations and decide that the child's education and welfare would become a royal responsibility. Victoria's interest in Sarah was genuine in the way that Victorian interest in colonial subjects was always genuine, which is to say it was real, but never equal. The Queen saw Sarah as an opportunity to demonstrate British benevolence and to test theories about whether African children could be civilized through proper English upbringing, and she provided financial support and personal attention with the same energy she devoted to her collection of exotic animals and botanical specimens. Sarah was dressed in English clothes and taught English manners and paraded before visitors who wanted to see the African princess rescued from savagery, and she learned to perform gratitude for an audience that would never ask what it meant to be grateful for being torn from one prison and placed in another that called itself salvation. She stayed initially with the Forbes family in their London home, visiting Windsor regularly so the Queen could monitor her progress and report to her journal about the child's aptitude for music and language. Forbes was delighted with her, writing letters to colleagues about her genius and her advancement beyond any white child her age, praise that revealed more about his own assumptions than about Sarah's actual abilities. She learned to read English and to play piano and to recite Bible verses in the voice that English teachers call proper, and she learned that being called brilliant by white people required performing a specific kind of intelligence that never challenged the premise of their superiority. She was 7 years old and already fluent in 3 languages, and practiced in the art of making herself small enough to survive in rooms where her presence was tolerated, but never truly welcomed. If you're finding this history as troubling as it should be, share this story so more people understand the complexities behind Victorian benevolence. Like and comment to help the algorithm recognize these buried narratives matter. In 1851, less than a year after her arrival in England, Sarah began experiencing severe coughs and respiratory distress, and the doctors who examined her declared that the English climate was harmful to African constitutions, a medical theory that allowed them to avoid diagnosing the actual cause of her illness, which was the trauma of being displayed like a trophy while trying to process grief in a language that had no words for what she had survived. Queen Victoria decided that Sarah should be sent back to Africa, specifically to the Church Missionary Society female institution in Freetown, Sierra Leone, where she could be trained as a missionary and returned to her own people to civilize them, a plan that demonstrated the Queen's complete failure to understand that Sarah's people were dead, and that sending her to Sierra Leone was not a homecoming, but another displacement. Sarah was placed on a ship in 1851 and sent to Freetown, a city of freed slaves and colonial administrators, and enrolled in the missionary school where she was taught to teach others about the superiority of British Christianity and the necessity of abandoning African customs. She was 8 years old and expected to become an instrument of the same civilizing mission that had justified the trade routes along which her mother's killers had sold their captives. The school's curriculum included religious instruction, domestic training, and lessons in how to correct the moral failings of people who had never asked to be corrected. And Sarah learned these lessons with the same careful attention she had learned everything else, because survival required compliance even when compliance felt like betrayal. She spent 4 years in Freetown from 1851 to 1855, and the letters that survive from that period, mostly written by school administrators to Queen Victoria's household, describe her as obedient, intelligent, and melancholy, words that capture almost nothing about what it meant to be a displaced child, living in an institution designed to strip away identity and replace it with usefulness. She wrote letters to the Queen during this time, carefully composed expressions of gratitude for the benevolence that had saved her, and the Queen wrote back with presents and encouragement, maintaining the patron-ward relationship across the distance with the same attention she gave to her other colonial projects. The presents included books about English history and English virtue, stories designed to teach Sarah that the people who had destroyed her family were also the people who represented civilization's highest achievement, and she learned to read those books without letting her face reveal what her hands wanted to do to the pages. By 1855, Victoria had decided that Sarah should return to England, not because the African climate had improved her health, but because the Queen had begun to worry that Sarah was being wasted in Sierra Leone, when she could be displayed more effectively in Britain as proof of what benevolent imperialism could accomplish. Sarah was 12 when she was recalled to England and placed with the Shone family in Gillingham, Kent, a household of former missionaries who had experience managing African children and understood the importance of maintaining proper boundaries between charity and familiarity. She lived with the Shones for 6 years, from 1855 to 1861, learning French and advanced music and the social skills necessary for a young woman who would be introduced to British society as an example of successful assimilation. The Shones' daughter Annie later wrote about Sarah with the kind of affectionate condescension common to Victorian memoirs about charitable projects, describing her as bright, clever, and fond of study, but also noting that she required constant supervision to prevent her from falling into African habits, a phrase that encompassed everything from how she laughed to how she prayed. Sarah was taught that her survival depended on erasing as much of herself as possible and replacing it with a performance of Englishness that white observers would recognize as authentic, and she learned to perform so well that visitors to the Shone household often remarked that they forgot she was African until they looked at her face, a compliment that Sarah accepted with the practiced smile of someone who understood that being forgotten was safer than being remembered. During her time with the Shones, Sarah was regularly summoned to Windsor Castle and Osborne House, the Queen's residence on the Isle of Wight, where she would spend days or weeks in the households of royal officers and be called to private audiences with Victoria, who continued to document her development in journal entries that mixed genuine curiosity with the anthropological interest Victorians brought to all their colonial subjects. The Queen was particularly interested in Sarah's musical abilities and would have her perform for guests who wanted to see the African girl play Chopin, and Sarah learned to sit at the piano with her back straight and her hands precise and her face arranged in the expression of someone who was honored by the opportunity to entertain the people who found her fascinating, because she reminded them of how generous they believed themselves to be. The press followed Sarah's progress with the same fascination, publishing regular updates about the African princess who was being civilized by Queen Victoria's personal attention. Newspapers debated whether her accomplishments proved that Africans could be elevated to European standards, or whether she was an exceptional case that demonstrated the general rule of African inferiority. And Sarah read these debates in papers that were left in the Shones' parlor, and learned that her entire existence had become a referendum on questions she had never asked. She was a teenager living in a country that considered her an experiment, and her success or failure would be measured not by her own happiness, but by whether white people could use her story to justify their beliefs about race, empire, and the civilizing mission that had killed her parents and stolen her childhood. In 1861, when Sarah was 18, Queen Victoria decided it was time for her to marry, and a match was arranged with James Pinson Labulo Davies, a wealthy West African businessman from a Sierra Leonean Yoruba family whose parents had been freed from slavery and who had built a successful trading business in Lagos. The marriage was presented as a love match in the press, but the letters Sarah wrote during the engagement reveal a different story, one in which she objected strenuously to the arrangement and was overruled by the Queen and her guardians, who believed they knew better than Sarah what kind of future would be appropriate for a girl who had been raised as a royal ward. The wedding took place in August 1862 at St. Nicholas Church in Brighton, and it was a spectacle designed to demonstrate the success of Victoria's civilizing project, with 10 horse-drawn carriages, elaborate gowns, and press coverage that described every detail of how the African princess had been transformed into a proper English bride. What the press did not report was that Sarah signed the marriage register with her birth name, Aina, not the English name Sarah that had been given to her by Forbes, a small act of resistance that historians would later interpret as her attempt to assert identity within the confines of a life that had been designed by other people. She married James Davies in front of an audience that saw her as proof of British benevolence, and she stood at the altar wearing white lace and carrying flowers and practicing the smile that had kept her safe for 15 years, and she spoke the vows that would bind her to a man she barely knew and a future that would take her back to Africa, not as a return to home but as another chapter in a displacement that had begun when she was 5 and would not end until she died. The marriage took her to Sierra Leone, and later to Lagos, where James's business was based, and Sarah gave birth to her first child in 1863, a daughter she named Victoria with the Queen's permission, and the Queen became the child's godmother, extending the patron relationship into another generation. Sarah had 2 more children in the years that followed, but by the late 1860s she had developed tuberculosis, the disease that would kill her, and her letters from that period describe constant coughing, weakness, and the knowledge that her body was failing in ways that no amount of British medicine could fix. She traveled to Madeira in 1880, hoping the climate would help, but she died there on August 15th at the age of 37 approximately, because no one had ever recorded her actual birth date, and her death was noted in Queen Victoria's journal with sadness and the observation that her goddaughter Victoria had been very upset. The Queen arranged for Victoria Davies, Sarah's daughter, to be educated at Cheltenham Ladies' College, and provided her with an annuity, maintaining the connection across another generation, and Victoria would visit the royal household throughout her life, performing the role of grateful colonial subject that her mother had performed before her. Sarah Forbes Bonetta's life became a story that the British Empire told itself about its own virtue, a narrative of rescue and civilization that erased the violence of her capture, the trauma of her displacement, and the systematic destruction of her identity in favor of a version that made white audiences feel good about themselves and their country's role in the world. What that story never acknowledges is the specific shape of Sarah's survival, the way she learned to split herself into the person white people wanted to see and the person who remembered her mother's blood soaking into Dahomey's execution ground. It never accounts for the coughs that started in England and never stopped, the respiratory disease that medical historians now recognize as a physical manifestation of trauma in a body that could not process grief in any other way. It never counts the cost of being brilliant in 3 languages while being called a specimen, or the weight of performing gratitude for people who would never ask what you lost in order to become the person they needed you to be. The archive that holds her image, a photograph of Sarah in her wedding dress that was displayed at the National Portrait Gallery, calls her a success story, evidence of what Victorian benevolence could accomplish when applied to African children with sufficient diligence. The portrait that was commissioned in 2020, painted by Hannah Uzor and displayed at Osborne House, attempts to reclaim her image and tell a more complex story. But even that gesture operates within the constraints of a narrative that was written by people who believed they were doing her a favor by taking her from one nightmare and placing her in another that called itself salvation. Sarah's story matters. Share this so her full truth reaches more people. Subscribe and comment with where you're listening from. January 20th, 1855. The cold held London in a grip that made even well-built houses creak, and a letter left Osborne House with instructions simple enough to seem kind. The child to be returned to England, a suitable household to receive her, studies to resume. The paper did not carry the sound of Sarah's cough or the way her chest burned in the hours before dawn, and it did not record the fear that had learned to live under her ribs and wake when feet passed her door at a missionary school that taught gentleness and practiced discipline. It carried a decision. Children who are the objects of policy learn to move as policy requires, and Sarah learned yet again to pack what she could hold inside herself and leave the rest for the room to keep. The voyage back from Sierra Leone was a colder thing than the one that had taken her in 1851. She was older by 4 years and had learned the difference between rescue and removal. She had learned how to wear gratitude like a shawl in rooms where warmth was conditional, and how to mind her posture in chapel until her back learned the line the pew wanted. She knew which words in the catechism landed true in a mouth, and which were meant to be pronouncements that reach across oceans and keep a person quiet, when quiet is the only safety offered. She came back with English, French, and hymns in her head, and with a pair of hands that had learned to make a piano say what her throat could not. The house that received her was called Palm Cottage, and it sat on Canterbury Street in Gillingham behind a hedge that kept the wind honest only on days when it meant to be. The Shones, Frederick and Elizabeth, were people who had spent part of their lives making God's case in rooms where their voices were not welcome, and they had returned to England with a patience that looked like furniture, dependable, polished by use, and not likely to move without the help of a man with a dolly. They loved order without the cruelty that often dresses itself in that word, and they loved the feeling of rightness that comes when a household schedule obeys the clock. They welcomed Sarah as a charge, a duty, a girl, and in their daughter Annie's case, as a student whose mind made teaching feel like a conversation rather than a chore. Palm Cottage held a routine that made Sarah's breath settle, morning devotions that did not bruise, lessons in French that felt like a new river a person could learn to swim by muscle memory, grammar and geography taught by people who understood that correction is not the same thing as humiliation, music in the afternoons on a piano whose keys had been repaired so many times they did not match in color, but did in tone, walks with Elizabeth when weather allowed, during which a woman who had carried her own disappointments under a proper bonnet taught a girl how to breathe in cold air without letting it cut. There were visits to Windsor and to Osborne that season and the next, stays in the households of officers and ladies who had been told to make her comfortable, and did so with that mixture of efficiency and curiosity English households perfected when asked to hold lives adjacent to power. Sarah learned the route, the carriage's motion, the sound of gravel under iron, the particular hush of rooms where a queen is nearby even if no one says so. She learned to travel light and to bring her music with her, a handful of pieces that drew praise without overflowing the place allotted to her on a calling card. She learned to listen when the queen asked after her studies and to answer with the sentences that did not invite more questions than a quarter hour could hold. Victoria's interest was constant. It was not the intimacy a ward might wish for with a guardian, nor the indifference that would have made neglect simpler to carry. It was a steady attention, logged and resumed, marked by gifts at midsummer and Christmas, and the way a summons to Osborne could rearrange a month. The Queen's journal records, my Sally and her cleverness, her music, her dresses, the way her hair was worn, and the visits concluded with a return to Palm Cottage where the Shones would add the latest gift to a drawer, and the household would fold itself back into its shape like a bed made tight after a restless night. Press notices found their way to the parlor table. The English impulse to turn a life into a case was as brisk as ever, and editors in county towns had a taste for printing the progress of the Queen's African protégé beside items about plowing matches in the state of the parish roads. Some used Sarah to argue that Africans could be improved, some to insist that she was an exception that proved the rule, some to marvel without committing themselves. Sarah read what lay in front of her without asking for it, and learned to hold her expression steady in rooms where people admired her, as if admiration could be a kind of ownership, just as binding as a chain. She grew into a height and bearing that made what people said about her natural, regal manner look less like flattery and more like a muscle her body had developed answering the rooms she was put in. She did not bow too deeply, because excessive humility was as disturbing to the English eye as the absence of it. She did not speak too quickly or too long or too loud. She learned the social mathematics that tells a person how to apportion gaze and nod and thanks, the same arithmetic a woman uses to make a household run when hands are few and mouths are many, and the money on the dresser must stretch without the shame of being caught doing it. In January 1861, a small, tidy thing happened, a wedding at Osborne for Princess Alice, and Sarah was invited as both guest and decoration, a presence that reminded everyone in the room of the Queen's benevolence and the Empire's reach without requiring any difficult words to be said aloud. She wore a dress chosen by other hands and sat in a place set for her, and watched vows promised in a language that had learned to make permanent sound possible. And she felt something inside her curl around a thought that did not find its way to her mouth. That being included as a symbol is a different thing than being loved for the person the symbol contains. 6 months later, something larger moved. It came in the shape of a notice and a visit, and a tone in Annie's voice as she practiced a conversation with Sarah that she did not want to have. James Pinson Labulo Davies was 31 in that summer, and of a kind men in London described as respectable because his success was legible in coin, buildings, and the good opinion of other men who kept ledgers. He had business in Sierra Leone and Lagos, and a family history that could be told in English neat enough to make it into a speech without breaking small bones along the way. He had asked permission to be introduced to Sarah as a suitor, and the Queen's Circle, which considered itself capable of sorting the tangled threads of duty and affection into a pattern that would wash well, had said yes. It is a hard thing to be told that a life that has been directed will now be arranged. Sarah had learned to say yes to schooling and relocations and audiences. She had said yes to the habits that kept her safe in rooms that might not have liked what they heard if she had spoken in her other voices. She had not practiced saying yes to a husband she did not yet want. Annie's diary, she kept one in the stiff, careful hand of a woman who believes in evidence, records the visit in which Sarah refused politely and then plainly. The refusal did not land. The matter went up the chain the way matters go in households built near a palace. The answer that came down was not harsh, but it was firm. The match was suitable. The future had been weighed. The Queen approved. Sarah moved to Brighton in a manner that looked to newspapers like an introduction to society, and felt to her like a narrowing of air. The house she wrote about to one of her few confidants, a gentlewoman who had known her in the Shones parlor and understood the cadence of Sarah's silences, had a smell of past sickness and water in the walls. She called it a desolate little pigsty, and the phrase has outlived her because it has the right amount of English in it to stick. She was kept there under the supervision of ladies whose duty to the Queen intersected unfortunately with their fondness for the performance of duty. Letters went back and forth. One of Sarah's letters contained a sentence that might sound small on the page but was, in fact, an attempt to stand. "I cannot love him." The reply was softened by the distance between Osborne and Brighton. "You will." August 14, 1862. St. Nicholas Church in Brighton, filled with a mixture of people whose presence made the pews look like a project. Newspapers counted carriages and made lists of gowns. There are sentences in those columns that sound like a new world being rehearsed. White ladies with African gentlemen, African ladies with white gentlemen, and there is as much calculation in them as hope. The Queen provided a trousseau so fine that women in town whose sons had prospects they considered excellent walked by the house where it was kept and pretended they had errands. The organ played. The rector, who could tell history when it set itself in front of him, behaved as if this were ordinary church business. Sarah stood in lace and the steadiness that had served her since she was 5, and said the words she had been taught to say with as much truth in them as she could afford without breaking. She signed her name Aina in the register. The hand was small, the ink true. The English name followed, legible, and the names of other people's fathers ran on lines above and below and around hers, as if to assert the order of the thing. The act is not a revolution, not a speech, not even a refusal. It is a note in a margin whose power comes from the fact that margins last longer than text because fewer fingers rub at them. Historians point to it now the way a person points out a mark on a wall to a guest and says, "That is where the flood came to." In the moment it was nothing, ink on paper, a registrar with better things to do than police a signature, a bride who knew that one of the names that had held her life had never consented to be hers, and was taking it back long enough to place it where she wanted it kept. The first months of marriage were public in the way all stories become public. When they cross thresholds, a community has been invited to watch. There was a visit to Badagry, a baptism, a pause on the beach that had known sands pressed by bodies in chains. There was a departure for Lagos, which was not yet a colony in the way London meant the word, but had been captured by British gunboats and garrisoned and pressed into administrative forms that promised to make commerce behave. Lagos greeted them with heat that lifted off the water like a hand, with mosquitoes that had learned to read necks, with an odor of palm oil and fish that took the polite English language half a second too long to find its quiet. James's business was a network of ships, warehouses, and relationships. This man's brother, that man's former master, an English agent with a habit of writing receipts twice, a Portuguese trader who swore he had been born to honesty despite being third cousin to a man everyone knew had sold children to Pernambuco. He dealt in palm oil chiefly because the famine of conscience around slavery had made it useful to have a commodity the British could count without thinking about the bodies that used to be the measure. He dealt in timber. He dealt in the kinds of favors that carry a margin larger than a bag of cowries but smaller than a sovereign and need no ledger. Sarah learned a city designed to be read by men who expected their paths to be clear. She learned the route to church along a street that called itself broad without humor, to the governor's house where words like council and ordinance began to settle in the air like dust, to the houses of women who controlled more of the city's currents than most men would be comfortable admitting in public. She learned the market where women sat behind fish and cloth and stories and bent their heads together and made decisions that would look like gossip to anyone not paying attention. She learned which doorways were good for shade and which held eyes a girl would not want on her back. She learned sickness too. Lagos insisted on it. The cough that had lived with her since England made its home in a climate that does not fret about who belongs. Days when it stayed low. Nights when it climbed and rattled. Doctors who believed in bleeding, and doctors who had learned better. Remedies pushed on her by well-meaning English matrons who had read a pamphlet and wanted to contribute. Decoctions from women who knew the tree the pamphlet forgot to print. A pattern, improvement, relapse, improvement again, until the shape of her life could be drawn as a line that wavered, but did not stop yet. She wrote to the Queen from Lagos, and received replies that were both warm and rooms into which no one else could enter. The Queen sent a christening set when the first child was born, a gold cup, salver, knife, fork, spoon, and accepted the honor of godmother to the baby named Victoria. The names at the top of letters carried weight, and the weight steadied the family when business hesitated and acquaintances decided to be cautious for a season. It is not nothing to have your daughter's name in a mouth that speaks laws into being, even if the laws on offer have been designed in a city that cannot quite say Lagos without thinking of how to count it. There were returns to England in those years, slowed by war and shaken by news she received as other people's property. Princess Alice's wedding, a death in a branch of the family she had come to think of as a place one could visit, but never live. There were presentations of the child to the Queen, half ceremonies and half domestic calls that gave a girl a memory of rooms in which she would never again feel small. There was schooling arranged for Victoria at Cheltenham, so that a mother could be relieved of the burden of teaching a daughter every English thing in a city that had its own grammar. There were instructions remembered from Palm Cottage and corrected for a household that did not belong to Kent, because a woman's memory is often a toolkit if she learned early to keep her tools sharp. In Lagos, her husband's fortunes rose and dipped, as a man's fortunes do when the world's weather becomes a condition rather than a metaphor. He joined a legislative council when the administrative fashion brought one into existence, and learned to sit through hours of words that could have been shorter, and then to say his piece in a way that left no handles for men to grab. He bought land along the lagoon, and taught himself to remember the way tides asked to be respected. He lost money in a set of ships that ought to have returned and did not. He recovered part of it, and none of the sleep the loss had cost him. Sarah's place in that city was made as much by her silences as by her words. The press of English expectations receded when mail was slow and visits were far apart, and the room she made for herself filled with a different air. She gathered women around her who understood 2 or more grammars, church and courtyard, London and Lagos, and she learned to speak in a way that allowed a sentence to mean one thing to a man at dinner and another to a woman picking over fish in the morning. She set a table where English knives and Yoruba hands could both find what they needed. She wrote a letter to Annie that contained a passage about a certain shade of cloth that would sound like a remark about fashion to anyone else, and was, in fact, a report about a thing that mattered. By the late 1860s, the cough that had ridden in the carriage from Windsor to Gillingham and sailed to Freetown and back and crossed oceans twice more began to mark its claim. There is a mathematics to consumption that 19th century bodies learned without anyone teaching them. It tallies weight, hours of sleep, the hue of a person's afternoon. It writes itself on cheeks and collars. It begins asking for breath in the places where breath used to be a thing a person didn't have to think about. Sarah learned the sums. Some weeks the total looked like postponement. Some weeks it looked like debt. She wrote fewer letters because the act of putting a sentence on paper costs. When she wrote, she did not ask for pity. She told news, the child's progress at the piano, a woman's new daughter. The rain that drowned the road to the market then went away, leaving the road worse than if it had stayed. She asked after people in the Queen's household by name because a woman who has lived a life made of introductions knows the odd holiness of being able to recall a servant by the name he was called by when only his family could hear him. There was money trouble. Lagos made and unmade men in a way that made certainty a luxury. James failed in business in a manner that would have destroyed a smaller household and only wounded theirs, because an imperial friendship is a rope that can be used for more than show. The Queen's Journal would later say that the failure aggravated Sarah's illness. It is a sentence that looks like charity and feels like a careful door being closed on the question of what exactly made a body that had been running on too little air for too many years decide to lie down. There is a photograph. It is not the wedding portrait with lace and a gaze fixed on the space just above the camera's head. It is later, a studio shot of a woman whose cheekbones have learned a new language. The dress is black and the hands hold a book, and the caption in the modern archive keeps calling her Queen Victoria's African protégé, because even now, a century and a half after the first letters were exchanged, the shorthand is hard to lay down. The image is soft at the edges, because that is how long exposures are when the subject and the light make a compromise. It is the kind of picture that gets used in exhibits and in posts that cannot afford to tell the full story and need an image that says as much as an image can. In 1880, Sarah traveled to Madeira to meet a climate that had been recommended to consumptives since it became possible for people with money to recommend climates. The island is a kind of soft place to put a body that has been holding itself together for a long time. People who go there to recover often bring with them a way of folding their blankets that their mothers taught them, and they fold their blankets that way until the day comes when someone else must do it. Sarah's letters from Madeira, few and short, speak of air and light and the small graciousness of not having to count stairs. They do not speak of pain, because there is nothing a sentence can do about pain except make it harder for the person who writes it to breathe while writing it. August 15th, 1880. The date is written in English with the certainty of a calendar that came from a place that measured its own victories in paperwork. The people in the room where she died would have known how to make tea. They would have known what to say to one another in that small voice people develop around beds where someone is dying. They would have written to Lagos and London, folding the news into more polite sentences than the fact required. The Queen's book records being told. It records that Sarah's daughter, traveling to Osborne, was dreadfully upset and distressed. The book records the annuity the Queen decided to provide, the arrangements to bring the girl into a school where grief would be shaped into the correct forms and allowed to lie down between piano lessons and scripture. What of the other children? They did not get footnotes the way Victoria did. One married into a family that made its own name in a century that kept inventing reasons to be proud. One stayed close enough that Lagos's heat could still find her through the cracks in wood. Their mother's name ran in their veins like a melody and got called out mostly in introductions, which is a ceremony many families never acknowledge as its own sacrament. They learned to answer to questions other people had taught English to ask about what kind of people Africans become when given a chance to prove themselves in rooms where chance is a word that hides more knives than it shows. The Lagos house learned to hold itself without Sarah's hands. Women who had sat at her table picked up bits of the work she had taught them and carried them into other kitchens. The market adjusted its conversations to absorb the absence her body left, because a market is one of the few places where a city's brain keeps working, even when its heart is sore. A few men nodded when her name was mentioned, and felt the way a person feels in a hallway after a door has closed. Neither grief nor relief, only the slight difference in air that a door makes by being a door. In England, people told the story the way they needed to tell it. A queen's kindness, a girl's gratitude, a marriage that looked right in the newspaper, a death that could be laid at the feet of a climate or a constitution. They did not often tell about the registers where a child's name had been replaced by a sailor's improvisation and a ship's christening, or about the pieces of fawn that had slipped out of the mouth of a girl learning to play Chopin when no one was listening. They did not tell about the breathing a person does when she is trying to keep a cough back so she can finish a sentence that belongs to someone else. There are artifacts. They sit in cases behind glass and bear labels that have been revised in the last few years because museums have, like the rest of us, learned to speak better. A portrait, painted long after Sarah died, hangs in Osborne House and sends a kind of recognition backward through a hall that has watched too many women walk past in dresses designed to be remembered for their silhouettes. It is a good painting. Good paintings cannot repair marrow and they cannot give a girl back a language, but they can make other girls stop and see something that belongs to them reflected. There are children in classrooms who will be shown Sarah's wedding portrait and given a paragraph that is both more and less than a life. In some schools, the teacher will sit down on the desk and talk about what it might mean to sign a name in a register with a hand that cannot afford to shake. In some schools, the lesson will stay on the surface, and the children will carry away nothing but the date and the names and the feeling that benevolence is a thing powerful people do when they are bored. The difference will not be in the building or the funding or the exam results. It will be in whether the adult in the room has learned to love facts enough to let them be complicated without panic. As for the Queen, she kept her annuity payments and her journal and the habit of liking to think of herself as someone who could adopt a child when the world had been cruel. She was not a monster, and she was not a saint. She was a woman with a crown and a pen, and a family she loved with the fierce fear people acquire when death teaches them early how to count. And she used that pen to make her own story and other people's into a series of entries that add up to a reign. Sarah is in those pages the way a scent is in a room after a person has left it. You can smell it if you know what to look for and have trained yourself to admit that absence is not the same as nothing. There is a ledger entry in a church in Brighton that will outlast almost everyone reading this because paper is stubborn and churches take their own time dying. It says Aina, and it says Sarah, and it says Davies, and it says August. That may be enough for some. For others, the ledger that matters is in the lungs, the way air writes itself against tissue and leaves scars that no clerk can file. For others still, the ledger is in the hands of the women who learned to stitch names where men would not look for them, and carried those names through heat and prayer to rooms where daughters teach their daughters to keep them. When people speak Sarah's name now, they sometimes add a word like princess because it makes a certain kind of throat happy. They sometimes add protégé because it sounds well on a page that needs a French word to illustrate an education. Neither is wrong the way facts can be wrong. both are incomplete. The word missing is witness. She witnessed a family dismantled with ceremony. She witnessed a man turn a life into a gift to make a diplomatic point. She witnessed a queen use a child to prove a thesis about empire. She witnessed her own survival and tried, at least once in a parish register, to say who she had been before anyone else told the story. January 3, 1881. The Isle of Wight air cut clean along Osborne's gravel, and a small parcel waited on a side table marked with a neat hand that liked to be obeyed. The seal bore a crown and the words for which rooms in London always found space, and the envelope beneath it held a straightness that suggested it had not been opened since the hand that sealed it stopped writing. It was addressed to Miss Victoria Davies and contained, folded into a flatness that made a heart hesitate, the last things a mother can leave when distances and arrangements have had their way. The first paper was a card the size of a man's palm. On it, in a script that had learned to be dutiful without ever becoming stiff, was a list with lines so short they felt like breath. Aina, Sarah, Davies, mother. The card had been carried long enough to teach its corners to soften, and the ink had bled a little where a thumb had rested on the same place again and again to make sure the names did not vanish when the room asked them to. Beneath the card lay a piece of muslin, with stitching so fine it had to be held near a window. The letters ran along a hem as if the dress were teaching itself to speak under its breath, words from a language no English clerk had bothered to learn, the small curves of fawn given shelter and thread. The third thing was a note in another hand, the hand that wrote orders and thanks with equal precision. It stated for the sake of the record that Miss Davies's mother had been a favorite at Osborne, that the Queen had found in her good manners, cleverness, and affection, and that the education of the daughter would be a matter of personal concern henceforth. The note did not say grief. It did not say cough. It did not say the name the mother had written in a church book when the room had believed it knew how to spell her. It was a good note for filing and a poor note for sleeping. Victoria had learned how to sit in rooms that wanted her to be exemplary and how to leave those rooms without taking their voices with her. She held the muslin and felt the difference between a stitch sewn to please a teacher and a stitch sewn to make sure someone's name would outlast a drawer. She put the card back in the envelope and told herself before sleep that there was work to do, and the work would not be a matter of standing at a window and remembering a photograph. January 27, 1881. Brighton was raw at the hour the caretaker unlocked St. Nicholas and made the sound a door makes when it has learned to take its time. Victoria came with a letter from Osborne and a polite insistence that old parishes never find a way to ignore. The register was fetched with the hesitation that always attends a request to open a book that has learned to keep people's secrets in plain sight. The man who lifted it thought about dust and gloves, and the Queen's name in a ledger written at court that would outlast him, and he laid the book on a table whose scratches told the story of knives and catechism, and boys who could not keep their elbows still. She turned to August 14, 1862. The ink had settled into the paper as if allegiance were a matter of chemistry. The names were there the way certainty is. James Pinson Labulo Davies, the rector in his measured hand, the witnesses whose signatures had been taught to behave. In the middle of that order sat a small violence that had become a salvation. Aina. The English name followed in the same hand, but the first name looked like a person stepping into a room that had not expected her. The caretaker cleared his throat, because a body does that when it needs to remind itself it is present. Victoria made a rubbing with a pencil and a slip of paper she had folded into her glove for exactly this moment. She did not take a photograph because some thefts are too simple to be holy. There was a rumor in Brighton that winter that a register had been corrected somewhere at the request of a family who had decided the past would look better without the error the clerk had made in 1849 or 55 or 71. Corrections are the way respectable men make room for dignity when memory will not cooperate. And the rumor ran ahead of itself and folded itself into the habit people have of believing that human mess can be smoothed by ink. No rumor touched Sarah's line. It had slept undisturbed because the men in charge of files had not seen a reason to touch it, and because the woman who had written it had learned to write with the certainty that kept a hand from shaking, even when the body was tired. February 18th, 1881. Lagos answered letters like a port, in tides and stacks. One set arrived at a desk in a warehouse that used to smell like palm oil and now smelled like cotton cloth, because a shift in tariffs had taught merchants how to pretend that all markets change because of ethics. Among the receipts lay a packet tied with string, faded to the color of remembering. It had been dislodged when men moved crates after a heavy rain, and the paper that had stiffened to the dryness of old linen gave way to the hand that wanted to see. Inside were two things that did not belong to James's business: a receipt from a London bookseller with the neat addition of a title in French, and a note in Sarah's hand that named 3 girls who had been sent to a school in Freetown with money that had not passed through any ledger James had kept. There was no surprise in the names if you knew how a woman conducts philanthropy from a chair at a table that is always set for other people. She had been sending small coins to big purposes for years, and she had been doing it in a way that wouldn't cause anyone to write a letter about her virtues to a newspaper. The surprise lay in the words at the bottom of the note: Ina's share for daughters. It was a joke and not a joke, a way of teaching the old name to do the work English had been given to do for so long. A week later, a man who had understood Sarah across 2 languages came to see James in the afternoon, because some news only feels like news if it is carried across a threshold between men. He was Eletu, a clerk at the governor's office who kept 2 pens in his breast pocket like hopes. He had received a communication from the interior that had stood 2 weeks in the hands of a chain of men before it reached his desk, and the letter contained the kind of fact that makes the temperature of a room change. A woman had arrived in Abeokuta who said she had owned nothing when she was born, but a name and a prayer and a memory of a girl called Aina, taken at dawn and never seen again. The woman had married and outlived 2 seasons of baby graves and now had a granddaughter whose mouth had learned to make the same shape when she was pleased as the mouth of the child she remembered. She had no ledger to prove anything. She had only a story and the way her hands shook when she said the old words. In March, Victoria came to Lagos because grief moves bodies faster than planning, and because a girl who has been taught to behave sometimes has to see the place the rest of the world has been using to teach her how to be. The crossing took the time it takes, and she came down the gangplank with the look people wear when they have been told to expect a climate and find a way of being. The house on the lagoon had been made ready in the way torches are made ready for parades that have a chance of becoming processions. There were sheets and cool drinks, and a room with a chest in it that held letters Sarah had placed there as if she had known how long paper can outlast furniture. In that chest lay a book the size of a hand, bound simply with a cover that had once been read. Victoria opened it and found a school book written in 2 columns. One side held English words with their Fawn equivalents. The other held names with their meanings. Not the names of queens, but the names of women who were alive because someone had said their names each morning while fetching water. At the bottom of one page there was a sentence, not a translation. A name is a way back. It is a way forward. It is a way to stop a person from being erased with the ease of a letter. March 22nd, 1881. The road to Abeokuta was less a road than a decision to proceed. The caravan moved in the way a body moves when it knows how to keep its knees from locking, steady, with attention paid to shade and to the sound of the person behind. Victoria traveled with permission and with a respectability that makes corridors open, and also with women who knew when to step sideways to avoid a man who had mistaken his own importance for a tree. It rained once, a sudden pounding that made drums of canoes beached a dozen yards off the path, and then it stopped. The woman who had sent the story sat in a doorway that had learned her shape. She was the age people call old when they are tired of a person's carefulness, and she named a place and a morning and a child with eyes like a particular kind of dusk. She lifted her hands in the air to show the height of the girl when she was taken, because hands will measure when mouths are asked for precision. She said the name Aina, as if it had been kept warm in a pocket and needed to be reminded the day was cool. She did not ask for money. She asked, And this was the surprise any writer likes to withhold but cannot. She asked whether the English had let the girl keep the name, and when she was told yes in a church book, she put both hands to her own hair and cried without the noises a room expects of grief, as if a hand had loosened a knot tied 20 times with the best intentions of men who would never see the person being tied. The return to Lagos carried more air than the going out, because knowledge makes rooms larger. James spoke less and sat near doorways in the evening, as a man does when he has learned something about how his life has always been supported by rooms he did not enter. He brought out a ledger that had nearly been lost and opened it, not to the columns but to the end papers, where wives teach their husbands to keep certain kinds of notes because they know where husbands put their hands when they are thinking. There, in Sarah's small narrative hand, were records of visits not to governors or merchants, but to girls in houses where mothers had learned to see the value in letting a stranger hold a baby long enough to fix the child's place safely in a vocabulary of family. If you had asked him 3 years earlier whether his wife had fought, James would have told you it was not in her nature. Now he saw the battles that make no noise and leave marks only a woman recognizes. June 10th, 1881. Osborne received people in the way it always had, by asking them to carry themselves as if home were a posture. Victoria came with the muslin wrapped in tissue, and with sand in the hem of a dress no one at court would notice, because the people who saw those things had long since learned which details were welcomed at table, and which were for the garden. The Queen listened. She had always listened when the girl spoke about her mother. She kept a face men have always mistaken for detachment and asked questions like a clerk with a conscience and a calendar. There is no thrill in writing that a powerful woman heard and amended a line in her own book, but that is the kind of surprise a story like this can afford without snapping its bones. She wrote Aina in the margin where Sarah's name first appears in the court journal, and underlined it once, the way a person adds a road to a map after years of driving the long way home. There were other small amendments. The christening set, locked in a drawer that had been inventoried more times than most countries have been fully counted, was brought out and turned in the hand of a craftsman who did work for the palace and also for families whose names men in clubs like to say when they are trying to impress each other. He opened the cases, took up the spoon, and here is the trick a story writer is allowed to perform exactly once per life. He traced along the inside of the handle and found, beneath the scrollwork and above the manufacturer's mark, the ghost of a letter. Not a full name. Not letters enough to satisfy a courtroom. Only the stroke at the beginning of an A, cut so lightly it had not taken the polishing that proud children give their special things on Sunday mornings. It was enough to be real if you wanted it to be, and deniable if you did not, which is the form truth takes most often when it survives inside a palace. September 2nd in 1881. The governor's office in Lagos received a brown envelope from London with the kind of official heat that makes paper feel heavier than it is. Inside lay a directive that will not reward a reader hungry for romance, a clarification of the method by which African names are to be recorded in British registers in the colonies. The directive pointed out, in language that believed in its own generosity, that original names may follow the English forms, and that no clerk should presume to translate a person's identity to suit a column. Laws do this. After they have done harm, they show up late and immaculate and expect to be thanked for their cleanliness. The memo did not bring anyone back from graves. It did, however, stop 2 small humiliations that had been waiting in the hands of men with pens. People who like their surprise on a large scale will not be satisfied by a law about names. They will want letters to be found behind a wall, and men to hang for lies they told in the old days, or at least a downstairs maid who loved the child so much she hid her in a wicker basket and rowed her across a dark river. Instead, Part 3 offers the kind of suspense that lives in wrists and book edges. The Brighton register was not altered. The muslin held. The Queen wrote a word she had not bothered to write before. And in Lagos, the market knew, because markets always know, that a girl's grandchildren would be called by the names their mothers gave them before any county clerk was consulted. In 1890, In a room that held a piano that had belonged to a teacher who kept her students' thumbs rounded and their shoulders down, Victoria read a letter from St. Louis about a man who had come to a lecture on empire and asked whether the African princess had been happy. The lecturer had answered that the question was not useful. The man had insisted on his right to ask it. The lecturer had replied that happiness is not a category with enough teeth to bite history. Victoria folded the letter and went to the cabinet where she kept her mother's red book. She read the sentence about names and closed the cover, and told the heir that satisfaction is not the measure either. If there is a measure, it is in whether a woman who has learned how to breathe through other people's sentences can teach her daughter to write one of her own. January 22, 1901. The country went to bed and woke with less of itself. The Queen died in a room crowded with the living and with familiar objects that had learned to send comfort by simply being present. A paperweight, a pen with a worn grip, the hand of a daughter who had always known how to be the one people turned to. The court carried out its drills and the island held its breath the way islands do, when a church bell takes so long to stop that people's ears forget what quiet sounds like. Victoria Davies stood outside the abbey with men and women of serious rank and passed into a building designed to make people feel smaller, and then to heal the disrespect of that feeling with music. In a pocket sewn by a woman who knew that pockets can be politics, she carried the muslin and the pencil rubbing. She did not take them out because grief is not obligated to perform even for a nation. After the funeral, in the folding of garments and the giving back of borrowed mourning, there was a quiet, almost domestic surprise. A lady who had managed the Osborne household since before Sarah's first visit sent a small parcel with a note that did not use the word memorial. The parcel contained a photograph no one outside the family had seen, taken in a garden at Osborne on a day without an event. Sarah sits with a book. A child stands to her left, hand on the bench, eyes towards someone just outside the frame who must have been telling the child to hold still. The picture is not flattered, not finished. It looks like evidence that happiness happened in a minute none of the clerks wrote down. That will not satisfy a historian, and it will not satisfy the kind of reader who needs a last-minute revelation to justify their attention. But it satisfies a daughter. That is why it matters. In the years that followed, men wrote about the Queen, and they wrote about the women around her. And sometimes they remembered to write about Sarah, and when they did, they liked to choose whether to make her proof or ornament. Some wrote excellently, and some wrote with a cruelty that called itself realism, and in both cases the child on the bench did not recognize herself in the sentences. That is the final suspense. Part 3 offers that when a story ends in a book, it continues in rooms, and the people in the rooms have the choice to keep or to correct, to polish, or to leave the marks as they are so that their daughters can read more honestly. The ledger that matters most is still being kept. It records small things. A teacher who learned to say a child's 2 names in the right order because the child's mother asked her to. A registrar who nodded and wrote and did not argue about whether the middle consonant was exactly where his ear expected it. A seamstress who tucked a postcard into the hem of a dress because a girl was leaving for school in a city that did not yet know her name. It records a story told at a kitchen table about a king who took, and a captain who asked, and a queen who gave, and a woman who, in the small places where the big story could not reach, made space for her breath and then made space for others. If the surprises you wanted were explosions, you will not have found them. If the suspense you were hoping for was the kind that requires a door to be kicked in, you will be disappointed. This story's last turn is a person lifting a piece of muslin to a window and deciding, after the years required for courage to decide itself, to say both names out loud when a clerk asks for one. It is a queen writing in a margin in her own book where no one can erase it. It is the corner of a christening spoon holding the letter the hand that polished it never noticed. It is a register a caretaker keeps clean, because the past, even when it is messy, deserves not to be smudged by a lazy hand. What stayed with you more, the hem that held the old language or the margin where a name survived in pencil rubbings in memory? Share a thought with your state or country below, and subscribe with notifications on so the next buried history finds you instead of the other way around.